Hi everyone, I'm Wendy, and today I'm sharing some tips for finding recipes and making them work for your particular plant-based lifestyle. There are so many different ways to eat a plant-based diet, and it can be difficult or almost impossible to find recipes that meet all of your standards. So I'll start by talking about my personal plant-based philosophy and how I eat, and then I'll give you some suggestions for finding and tweaking recipes to suit your own needs, no matter what kind of diet you eat. If you've been following me for a while, you're already familiar with my eating pattern from all of my What I Eat in a Day videos. But there have been a lot of new people recently, so I want to welcome you all and explain a little bit about how I approach a plant-based diet. On my channel, I love to share information about different styles of plant-based living. Every expert out there has their own spin on how to do it. There's specific approaches like the starch solution, the daily dozen, nutritarian, the goodbye lupus protocol, and more. Then there's also more general philosophies like flexitarian, SOS-free, or various forms of a raw vegan diet. It can get really confusing if you're trying to figure out what's best, and if you start strictly following one plant-based guru, but then another expert contradicts something they said, you might start to question everything. So my basic philosophy is a little different. I prefer to avoid strictly following one particular approach. Seeking perfection can get exhausting, and only following one expert will lead to confusion when you run into anything different. And if you watch someone like me and try to replicate what I'm doing, it might not work for you. We all have different activity levels, different baseline health, and different goals. So we all have different dietary needs. If you have a particular approach that works for you, keep doing it. But if you're getting lost in the confusion, I recommend you focus on the big picture. What do all of these different approaches have in common? It's a diet that's focused mostly on whole plant foods. That means eating most of your calories from whole grains, beans and legumes, starchy and non-starchy vegetables, and fruit. From there, figure out what else works for you. Maybe that's eating some nuts and seeds and some minimally processed foods. Or maybe you even still include some animal products and a few ultra-processed foods. We're all a little bit different, and while it's clear that a primarily whole plant food diet is optimal for everyone, the exact makeup of our diet will be individual to each of us. What's most important is what makes up the bulk of your diet. The variations in the last 5 to 10% of your calories aren't as significant. Having said all that, once you find the eating pattern that works for you, it can be a challenge to find recipes that check every box. I hear people lamenting all the time about different cookbooks that use this or that ingredient, and they just throw the whole thing out because it doesn't match their philosophy exactly. But it doesn't have to be complicated, and I'll show you how using my own diet as an example. About 90% of my diet is made up of whole grains, beans, veggies, and fruit, and the remaining 10% is minimally processed foods like pastas, whole grain breads, tofu, tempeh, and homemade desserts. I also align pretty closely with an SOS-free diet, but not strictly. SOS-free stands for a diet that is free of added salt, oil, and sugar. In my own cooking, I never use oil, and while I never use refined sugar, I do use date sugar and date syrup. I also don't add salt in my cooking, but I do sometimes use products such as coconut aminos or miso paste, which are high in salt. I use these in small amounts as well as some other condiments that have salt in them. In addition to no oil, I personally eat a lower fat diet. So while I don't eliminate them completely, I only eat small amounts of nuts, seeds, avocados, and other high fat foods. If you look at any of the recipes on my channel or website, they'll align with this philosophy. Many people would look at my diet and say it's restrictive. I would beg to differ because I now enjoy a greater variety than I ever did as an omnivore. But my point is, even with these particular guidelines, which some find restrictive, I'm still able to make any recipe work for me. Let's look at how to find a recipe and tweak it to suit our needs. Whenever I'm looking for a recipe, I'll start with a quick internet search, and I'll look for any recipe, whether it's intended to be plant-based or not. Say I wanted to make chili. I'll search for that and check out a few recipes. Let's look at this classic chili from the Delish website as an example. The first ingredient is olive oil. Like I said, I don't personally consume oil. If you do, feel free to include it. But when I see this in a recipe, I'll glance at the directions to see how the oil is used. We can see that in this case, the oil is just being used to saute the onion. When that's the case, I simply leave it out. Easy peasy. If the oil had served another purpose, like in a salad dressing or a baked good, I would use some kind of substitute. I have another video that goes through various methods for cooking and baking without oil and how to replace it when needed. I'll put a link to that video here on screen if you want those specific tips. Now back to this chili recipe. Next, we've got onion, garlic, and tomato paste, so we're all good there. Then we have ground beef. Usually, when I see any kind of ground meat, I'll just substitute it with lentils. Depending on your specific food philosophy, you could choose some other substitutes. For example, there are vegan ground meat substitutes that you can buy. These range from pretty healthy to highly processed. Or you could use a homemade substitute. I love the vegan ground sausage and ground hamburger recipes from Javant's Healthy Vegan Eating YouTube channel. I'll put a link to his recipes in the details below this video. But I usually like to go with the easiest and the most whole food option and use lentils. For 1.5 pounds of ground meat, I'd probably substitute about 1.5 cups of dried lentils. Now, let's say instead of a ground meat, this recipe called for chicken. In that case, I usually just add in chickpeas or some kind of white beans. But depending on the type of recipe, you could also use things like soy curls, young green jackfruit, or you could add in some tofu, tempeh, or even seitan, although that's slightly more processed. If you wanted something even closer to the taste and texture of actual meat, you could go for a more highly processed vegan meat substitute. I've been away from meat long enough that I don't really desire the texture of meat, so that's why I simply leave it out or swap it with beans or lentils. Again, this is all about finding the swaps that work for you, so experiment with different options and know that it takes a little time for your taste preferences to change. But over time, the more you eat this way, you may find you prefer the more whole food options. Back to our classic chili recipe, next up it calls for various herbs and spices and then some kosher salt. As I mentioned, I prefer to cook without any salt. So when a recipe specifically calls for it, I either leave it out completely or add a no salt seasoning blend in its place. Sometimes I'll simply bump up the amount of other herbs and spices in the recipe or add some granulated onion and garlic for extra flavor. Our taste buds adapt to what we eat regularly. So since I've been cooking without salt for years, my palate has adjusted to a low sodium diet and I can usually get away with just leaving it out of a recipe. But those who are still consuming a high sodium diet would probably find a lot of my food to be bland. So this is about adjusting it to what works for you. I found this food to be bland at first as well, but now I enjoy it just as much as I used to enjoy salty foods. In fact, I can't even tolerate really salty food anymore. So if you want to work towards a lower sodium diet, just meet yourself where you're at today. And I suggest only adding the salt at the table. So you sprinkle on just enough to get the flavor, but you can slowly start to adapt to a lower sodium diet. Moving along in our recipe, we have black pepper, so no swap there, and then crushed tomatoes. I personally would choose the no salt added crushed tomatoes when possible. And the same with the kidney beans. If using canned, I'd try to find low or no sodium options. Finally, the recipe calls for shredded cheese, sour cream, and scallions. I'm okay with the scallions, but I would simply leave out the other items. Of course, if you like, there are vegan options for cheese and sour cream that you could buy. And if you really wanted, you can also find recipes for homemade vegan versions that might be a little healthier. A plain vegan yogurt would also be a great swap for sour cream. I don't really crave these types of condiments as much the longer I've been away from them, so I usually just leave them out. So that's how easy it is to take any regular omnivorous recipe and make it vegan or plant-based. Next, I want to show you one more example using an already vegan recipe, but tweaking it to fit my dietary approach. There are so many great gourmet vegan recipes out there, but they're much richer than what I usually eat. So here's how I make these a little lower in fat and salt. I love watching Nisha of the Rainbow Plant Life channel because she makes such beautiful and tasty food. But she often uses higher fat ingredients that I prefer to avoid. Take this creamy cabbage curry, for example. All her recipes are vegan, so I don't have to worry about animal product swaps. But scrolling through the ingredients, here's what I would change. Again, oil is used for sautéing, so I'll simply skip the oil. Moving past these veggies, we have salt again. Same rules apply as before. I leave it out, bump up the other spices, or use a salt substitute. Then we get down to full-fat coconut milk. As I mentioned, I eat a low-fat, whole food plant-based diet. And not only is coconut milk high in fat in general, it's specifically high in saturated fat, so I like to avoid it. Depending on how much fat you want in your diet, you might swap this for a light coconut milk. But I would probably simply use another plant-based milk like cashew or soy. These will definitely be less creamy than the coconut milk, so it will change the texture and mouthfeel of this dish. But again, you adapt to what you eat most of the time, so I don't mind that difference. If you still wanted that coconut flavor, you could simply blend your choice of plant milk with a little bit of unsweetened coconut flakes, or just add a couple drops of coconut extract to get the flavor. Next on the list is nut butter, another high-fat food. For me personally, even though I reduce my fat intake, I wouldn't mind adding this to the recipe. Since it's just 2 tablespoons in the whole recipe, each portion is only going to have a small amount. However, in practice, I never keep nut butters in the house because I've been known to sit and eat nut butter with a spoon until I've had way too much. I can't stop myself if it's in the house. So I would leave this out simply because if I bought and opened a jar just for the recipe, that jar probably wouldn't last the rest of the week. Finally, I want to say a few words about cookbooks. I often hear complaints about plant-based cookbooks because maybe it includes some oil or maybe other processed ingredients or even a few animal products. I understand how frustrating it is when you trust someone who touts the benefits of a 100% plant-based diet and then their book isn't 100% plant-based. But I want to encourage you to look past that. As I showed you today, it's usually very easy to make swaps or simply leave things out. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If we only used recipes that aligned with our dietary pattern 100%, we're going to be disappointed. I like to think we're all on the same team, and it's good to support the big picture message of eating more plants. If we criticize books that don't perfectly fit within our paradigm, we potentially hurt the spread of that big picture message. We have to remember that the majority of the population is not vegan or plant-based. In fact, most are far from it. Often these authors and experts include these options as a way to bring more people in. If all plant-based books were 100% plant-based, we risk alienating those who just aren't ready to dive in 100%. Once you've fully immersed yourself in a plant-based lifestyle, it's easy to get frustrated with the world we live in. But instead, I recommend remembering where you started from. And most of us started from a standard American or other westernized diet. Maybe you were even resistant to the plant-based message at first too. So have a little grace for those who are early on in their plant-based journey, and as you build your own plant-based muscles, you might see that you don't need to follow recipes exactly. They can just be a jumping off point to make something even better. If this video was helpful, I hope you'll give it a thumbs up and stick around for plant-based meal ideas, what I eat in a day videos, and more. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.